I'm going to be talking about a topic that is very familiar to many of you, but I'll be talking about it in a slightly different way. This topic's on creating digital content, sharing it online, and participating in basically any sort of online social computing space. This is how we connect with other people, how we express ourselves, show humor, show attachment to other people, and maintain relationships. And today we're going to talk about this all through the lens of aging, what it means to be an older adult and participate in these sorts of spaces. So to help you understand why this problem space is important and interesting, I'll start with a quick story. So this is Ethel. Ethel is 105 years old. So at 105, you would imagine she has sort of normal age-related memory loss. So she forgets people's names or her relationships to them. And she's becoming somewhat socially withdrawn. So her daughter, Alice, is often looking for opportunities to engage her mother in social interaction. Her daughter, Alice, knows how important it is to keep her mother engaged and stimulated, but her mother won't touch an iPad or anything else that looks like technology. So now consider John over here. John has the early stages of dementia. John, at one time, though, however, he's an active computer user. At one time, he ordered order after order of the same exact item, and these boxes kept arriving at the house. John's also on Facebook, and John's posting things like, I'm headed out of town for 2 weeks. I'm headed off to the bank as well. Right? So things that shouldn't really be posted online. Now, John and Alice are married, so Alice sees what's happening with her husband and also the situation with her mother. Alice is pretty tech savvy as an older adult. She has over a dozen online accounts for her banking information, health, social connections. So at this point in time, she doesn't want to hand over power of attorney like her husband has had to do to her. So she asks her children, who are also in their 60s and older adults, to just check on her from time to time. The best we can do right now is she says, here are my login credentials for my bank account. Just kind of peek at my files and make sure everything looks squared away. Go time to time, look at my Facebook feed and my Facebook profile. Make sure I'm not connecting with any sort of unsavory folks. So this is really complex, right? And then Alice's children also have their own desires. They want to connect with their grandmother and their father, but their grandmother doesn't use the same sorts of platforms that they use, and their father often doesn't remember them or his relationship to them. So in today's talk, I'm going to introduce several systems that help us think about what it means to design for staying active and engaged online throughout the lifespan. So as I started to allude to it, this is a really important topic for many reasons. One is that as we get older, our social networks tend to shrink. But there's also this very clearly established relationship between having late life social support and having positive physical and mental health outcomes. Then the flip side of that is that social isolation can be associated with higher rates of disability, slower recovery from illness, and even early death. So it's really important that we think about ways of helping people maintain their active social lives throughout the lifespan. Now, the good news is that recent analyses show that if you're active online as an older adult, you're less likely to feel depressed, socially isolated, or lonely. Again, some bad news. Back in 2014, still 41% of older adults, this is people in the US, 65 and older, based on Pew Research data, were still offline. Now, this gap is closing some, but there are a significant portion of older adults in the US who are still offline. One of the contributing factors to being offline is disability. And so as we know, as we age, it becomes a very complex experience with changing values, changing experiences and needs, but also changing abilities. So if you think of even the youngest cohort of older adults, and this is US Census data, even people 65 to 69, 1 in 4 has a severe communicative, cognitive, or physical disability. Couple that with the striking report from the Alzheimer's Association. 1 in 3 people is expected to die, at least of older individuals passing away, with dementia or Alzheimer's disease. So this is very pervasive when we think about age-related disability. So this is the topic for our conversation today. Now in HCI, though, we tend to start, we think about this as a way of solving problems of aging. So we think about technology as helping people remember medications or preventing wandering behavior. Now these are important issues, but they're only one aspect of the experience of what it means to get older. What about creativity? What about social longing, forming new relationships, new partnerships? These aspects really aren't often examined within the literature. It's much more, as computer scientists, we're often comfortable with identifying a problem and then knowing when we've arrived at a very clear solution to some sort of aging-related problem. So this is part of my theoretical framing, and it draws from the field of critical gerontology that sort of destabilizes these narratives around what it means to be an older person. Couple that with my view of cognition. So typically, we approach cognition from an information processing theoretic. So that's bound up within an individual's head. And instead, when we're dealing with individuals with cognitive impairment, that puts the burden on that individual as lacking, as having a deficit. But instead, if we start to view cognition as distributed across people, time, space, and even our cultural practices, that changes fundamentally how we approach system design and how we study our technologies in the field. So instead of studying the individual and perhaps a cognitive impairment located within that person, we can study an intelligent system of activity, a caregiver working alongside an individual with a cognitive impairment. We can study the system of activity that includes technology. We can start looking at cognition as an emergent property of interaction. So cognition is happening, it's there for us to study. It's not what's missing within an individual. And we can also start thinking about the role that technology can play in this process of meaning making. So again, I'll be talking a lot about this intelligent system of dyads working in co-located spaces and how technology can fit into that.
This is a really intriguing perspective. I'm wondering, have we seen anyone study how much someone tends to start distributing their cognition as they start to age? So, things that I used to try to keep in my own head all the time, is there some curve where we see like people start to, put Post-it notes on places, put reminders, put things in the environment, or ask others to help with them? And do we know like what that actually looks like?
Absolutely. There's a whole line of work that's starting to think about that, using distributed cognition as one theoretical lens. We could talk about it later if you want during the discussion, but absolutely, I think that's an important part of us understanding what it means to live with a cognitive impairment. And my view of a cognitive impairment is that we all have them at various times in our life, right? It could be medication-induced, it could be stress. I've had 3 kids. After I have a baby, I definitely have a different level of cognitive functioning than I do at other times. And so we think about cognitive impairment as working throughout all of our lives, not just as a particular condition that an older person might have. Okay, so just to tell you a little bit about who I am and what I do. So I'm primarily a qualitative researcher. I start out by going to the field. I work in therapy clinics, retirement communities, schools, nursing homes, and I start by doing in-depth observations and interviews with a variety of stakeholders. From there, we start to design new sorts of prototypes that help us understand things. So these prototypes generally, we'll think about testing them for initial accessibility and appeal, but then we put them back out into the field with our field partners for weeks, months, and even years at a time. And here we're really looking for things like changing communication practices. Has someone now adopted this technology over time in a way that previously they hadn't? Are people more motivated to interact and to communicate socially? Are people communicating or interacting in a way that's now more independent than they previously did? And then with that, with these long-term understandings of these systems in the field, we can start to contribute back to our fundamental theories of human social behavior and our practices with technology. So to say it very simply, I'm an ethnographer or a qualitative researcher who builds systems as a way of understanding phenomena in the world. So today I'll show you, or I'll share with you just a couple of these different systems and these different contexts of study. The first one involves the woman you met in the introduction. This is Ethel. And this study is about audio-enhanced paper photos. This work was done a couple years ago, but I still think it's relevant to our discussion today. This is a case study that focuses on Ethel's last year of life. So we started out by doing observations and interviews with Ethel's family. Now this is the wall in her room. Okay, this is pretty characteristic of a lot of the older individuals that we work with, having lots of printed family photos displayed around to share with other people. And we found out that these are particularly important as a way for Alice, Ethel's daughter, to engage her in conversation. So Alice says, I come into Ethel's room, say a few things, and she doesn't really interact in the conversation. But if you start talking about who someone is in a picture, and do you remember that person, it gives a focal point for communicating. So we're thinking about, in the early stages of this project, building on this practice of sharing paper photos. And so within the field of HCI, there's a long history of enhancing physical objects and printed materials with audio or sounds of the moment. And so the work today will build on this long history. But at the time of this study, there really wasn't anything available for an end user, a non-technical end user, to create their own interactive paper documents on the fly. And so we created the tap and play system to address this. And this system allows the user this is a commercial LiveScribe pen with dot pattern paper, to sketch out an interface and program it and say, when someone taps on this region, I want it to play this particular message, or I want it to recognize handwriting. So the system works like this. So it recognizes any sort of user-defined polygon on interactive dot pattern paper. Then using this custom control panel, so this is the authoring interface, is the pen, paper, and this custom control panel over there. You can decide whether the region plays audio, records audio, or recognizes handwriting. You can decide what sort of interaction should make this execute. So this is important. These look very basic. It can recognize more complex gestures, but the difference between a pen down and a single tap gesture is huge for this population. We found time and time again for a lot of the older adults we're working with, when they touched the pen to the paper, they expected the magic to happen, right? And so being able to author at that level was pretty important. But then you can also do other things with these regions. So you can associate this with a word in a lexicon to say, when someone writes something in here, recognize these particular keywords, or do whatever was saved over in this. So it can, in this region, it can save as a pointer to another region. So all of this is encapsulated in the idea of a region, stored on the pen, and then written out in XML so you can exchange these customized activities between pens. So this tap and play system we developed over a 2-year time period. It began with an early ethnographic study of speech-language therapists using printed materials as part of rehabilitation for adults who'd had a stroke and needed to relearn to speak and regain language. And what we saw here was that they had many ideas for enhancing these paper documents, but weren't able to do this on their own. And so we created a first version of this system, deployed it in the field. Some things needed to be improved, so we continued to iterate. And finally, the tap and play system that I shared with you, we deployed with over 100 people in 4 different contexts. And today, the study with Ethel's family is just one of those. So when we gave them these materials, they created an interactive audio-enhanced photo album for Ethel. So here you can see interaction across 5 generations of her family. So children were able to easily walk up and add songs or their own stories to Ethel's book. This photo album became this evolving family artifact. So this is one of Ethel's daughters. And she's recording a message here, which I'll play if we set up the audio correctly. Hopefully it will work. This is a photograph from the 1940s. It has Ethel and her husband and her 4 children in here posing. And so this is what her daughter says as her memory.
I remember this day very vividly in my mind. I can still smell the pine cones. I can remember the water. I can remember us standing and taking that picture. I don't remember a lot about my childhood, but this I do remember. This is Ruthie.
So you can see it was very evocative for her as the daughter who's going back and revisiting these photos. So what's nice about this is here we're actually studying a group of older adults. So Ethel is 105 and all of her children are in their 80s, late 70s and 80s. So this is a group of older adults who are designing content for the purpose of engaging the family matriarch. And so we started to see a few design conventions emerge. People in this family called this talking photos. So they would tend to circle a person's face and have that message attached right to her face. This seemed to work pretty well for Ethel, so they would speak out loud. The family also arranged the photo book in an interesting way, and it's all about Ethel's experience. We thought chronologically might be important for this person going back through her life, but instead it was about family relationship. And the properties of the paper photos allowed them to layer upon layer photographs of children as they age. And so Ethel could go back and listen to the audio messages coupled with that over time. But to me, the most striking thing is how they use these group photos. So we think about a comment thread on a Facebook photo. Maybe there's some teasing and some jokes going on. Here is an example of that played out in audio-enhanced photos. So this is a picture of Ethel and her 4 children. And her youngest daughter said, "Hello, my name's Mary. Ethel is my mother. I'm her youngest and most beautiful child by far, probably the best one of the bunch." And each of her children added their own message, and they're teasing back and forth. And so this is the kind of experience that Ethel was able to go back and revisit in her photo album.
This is a more minor question about sort of the usability of paper interfaces. When I've done this kind of work in the past, like the readware and editware becomes really awkward here because the more you use the interface, the more it gets sort of obscured by dots from the pen as people are pushing on it. Was this like not heavily used enough for that to be an issue? I'd hate to see the photo end up getting like just totally obscured by dots.
Very, very minor question. Glad you brought it up. So there's a non-marking pen tip you can use with the pen. So you can use it basically just as a stylus to touch instead of making marks on the paper.
And then they swap out the pen tip, and from then on it's just a stylus.
So they would strategically do that, right?
Okay.
But it's actually, you think about this bug being a feature when you're going back to look at the use of the album and you see these heavily, these traces of use, that actually can be a nice thing, in addition to the system logs, of course. Okay, so one other thing we can do with this data, now that this family has generated all of this data for us, we can start to understand the sorts of messages that they're crafting for Ethel, right? So this family, and especially you think about Alice, who's the main message author. This is Ethel's family tree broken down by generation, and what you see here is the size of the circle represents how many messages each person in the family tree created. The color represents how many features we coded in that message. So an example of a feature is a marker of time or a relationship. And over again, we saw Alice, you would think she's the person who knows her mother the best, interacts with her daily, used this photo album with her daily. Recorded messages like this. This is Alice, your daughter, at the beach. Right? So she always identified herself and her relationship, whereas a lot of the other authors and the family members didn't think to do this. So even this level of authoring gives us some insight into the types of support that someone with late life memory loss might need. So now we want to say, okay, what happened? So we gave this to the family. What are the outcomes? Everyone wants to know that. So after 5 weeks, we did see some improvements. This is based on survey data from Ethel's family members and nursing staff. So people started to note improved quality of conversations they had with Ethel, that she had a greater interest in socializing with other people in her community, and that they were even noticing an improvement in the range of motion of her right arm. So think at 105, the last year of your life, any improvement is a good thing. But then after 5 months of use, we started hearing things like this from the family member and the nursing staff, from the family members. She doesn't point to the bulletin board as she used to do, asking me if I knew all those people. So by repeating this process, she's gradually relearning who these people are. So now the nurse was saying, never before would she show her who these people were in the pictures were, but now she will. She'll point to the family pictures on the wall and tell me who they are. And then the other daughter's also saying things like this process of revisiting these family photos is helping her relearn who people in her family network are. Okay, so why was this case successful? We can say it's successful because of a couple reasons. One, as I mentioned, any sort of engagement we're seeing when the norm is really withdrawal and isolation, especially in the last year of your life. Ethel was quite socially withdrawn and didn't really want to interact with anybody before bringing this sort of technology into her life. And so we saw some improvements, and that was really exciting and encouraging, even for an N of 1 case study. But this is really a case of this older adult family group collectively authoring these materials. And I'd argue that this photo album and the digital pen system we created was at just the right level of abstraction. They were able to do what they wanted to do in an efficient and clear manner with it, and not much more. But it also really drew on their existing photo sharing practices, which is quite important, right? They weren't asked to shift their practices to looking at these photos now on an iPad or something. And in fact, at one point we took away the book and started to do an analysis. And Alice wrote to us and said, we really need that back. We've stopped watching TV in the evenings and we've started looking at this book, and now, Mom really misses it now that you've taken it back for your analysis. Could we please have it back? She said, I've also tried to show her photos on an iPad, and she says, no, put them in the book. I don't want anything to do with that. So for this particular centenarian, this sort of hybrid media really worked well. Okay, so moving from that particular case study where Ethel was involved, but she was not front and center in the creation process, now I'm going to describe some work from the context of art therapy involving older adults with dementia, where these individuals are definitely front and center in the creation and sharing process. We're going to talk about what that means for thinking about sharing and participating in online social environments through therapeutic artwork. Okay, so dementia is marked by a significant decline in cognitive ability that affects your language and your memory. It can be a very isolating experience as well, plagued with anxiety, depression, and society really tends to view dementia. When you think about dementia, you don't have a warm fuzzy about it, right, when I'm talking about this. It's not an exciting topic. You guys are here, last class of the semester or quarter. Thank you for doing that. Dementia is not an exciting topic, but hopefully today it will be. And so what we're going to do is think about this typical positioning of people with dementia in our society, and we're going to turn it on its head. We're going to study the context of art therapy. And so we've been working in art therapy for over 2 years now, and also interviewing a variety of art therapists in addition to our observations. Art therapy is all about self-expression. It's a way of when a person does not have words, maybe not the ability or the desire to produce language, they can create art as a way of expressing their desires and their needs and their own experience with disability. So art therapy is about providing people with a sense of dignity, where in the rest of your life, you may not be able to choose what you wear, what you eat, or where you go. But in art therapy, it's all about empowering people as creators and as competent and engaged individuals. So what's special about art therapy, and I'd argue the arts more broadly, is this. This is a quote from our therapist, one of the main people we've worked with. She says, when you're having a creative interaction with somebody, you're not bound by the normal linear conversation and socially acceptable rules of what's appropriate. You don't even necessarily have to be able to speak coherently to be able to express yourself creatively. Right? So when we think about the social rules we have that prize logic and reasoning, those are far less important in the arts. Things like your sensory experience, humor, emotional awareness, and creativity are all valued, and those are all continuing strengths of people with dementia. But making and sharing artwork in this context depends on the facilitating role of the art therapist. Remember, I said I'd come back to this intelligent unit of interaction between a therapist and a person with dementia or cognitive impairment. And here's where we really see this this work happening in a deeper way. So the therapists hone what they call their third hand, okay? So the third hand is, and this is written by a famous art therapist, Edith Kramer, she says it helps the creative process along without being intrusive, without distorting the meaning or imposing your own ideas and preferences on the client. You use your artistic competence and imagination in empathetic service of other people, right? So the therapist is there. Their job is to be the third hand like machinery, make the physical work happen. So this is a woman with Parkinson's disease, and she's trying to line up a particular piece of paper on her art project right here. And so the therapist comes in at the right moment and helps her accomplish this. And what the therapist says when we asked her about this, it was always her process. I was the extra hand. That's what a therapist should be doing by second nature. This is a very empowering process, especially as I mentioned, compared to other aspects of daily life. And really seeing artwork in this way is a conceptual shift, and we've written about this in a recent or an upcoming Chi paper. It shifts from viewing dementia as an impairment, and it's all about a deficit and a loss, to thinking about people's behaviors as expressions of who they are. Now, this particular woman right here, she had a stroke, and so she has some limited range of motion. She cannot speak fluently, and she has some limited range of motion in her arm. But what she does is often grabs a paintbrush and does this rhythmic motion. And so the therapist introduced art materials to take advantage of this. And now what was usually seen as a negative symptom of a disease is an expression of the self. And so they're not painting on, construction paper with Crayolas. They have fine art materials. So this is a silk scarf that this woman created. And it's her signature style. This style has emerged over time as she's been in art therapy. And I can tell you this family has vied over her artwork. They're actually fighting over who gets her artwork. It's become a prized possession. So now you take a person who really is questioning their role in society and their value and what they can contribute, and you put them in a position where they're the one who's able to gift and to show they're contributing back to their own family. Okay, so some of you may not care about art therapy or older adults or aging in general, so let me try to give you a few reasons why I think this context is really important for design, particularly if you're at all interested in health and information systems. So one is that we can start to look at the health benefits. We can actually look at some outcomes of staying socially engaged through artwork and art making if we have systems that allow people to do this. So this is a predominantly offline group of people we're talking about. And what would it mean to create systems that help them stay connected over the long term with their loved ones? This is also, artwork is an instance of protected health information. So artwork serves as both an expressive artifact and as part of the health record, right? So it's this boundary object that goes between these two worlds. So there's a lot that's bound up in that, right? This artwork, even though we see it as an expressive artifact, is still bound by HIPAA. So we have ethical and legal considerations around what it means to share it. And now we start to even zoom out further, and we see that things we take for granted around sharing and maintaining our own privacy online are much broader than a single individual. They involve that individual, caregivers, members of the broader care team, nurses, doctors, family members, and most importantly, an authorized representative. So the older adults we work with have signed over often their own rights, essentially, their power of attorney to a family member. And if they say, I'd like to put my artwork in an art show, but their family member says, you know, this kind of reveals that you have dementia and we don't want all of your friends to come and see this, so we're not going to let you put that in the show. This is true, this happens. The authorized representative can overstep the bounds of this person being an artist. So again, we're able to understand some of these tensions and how families are negotiating sharing these expressive artifacts. Okay, so we've started prototyping some systems. What would it mean to capture this artwork that's produced? We created a Wizard of Oz prototype. This is an interactive frame that has an Android tablet built into it. As I was telling Camille, we spent hours and hours creating clickable paper buttons for paper prototyping because we thought there's something so gratifying about feeling that click and feeling like you have made a change in the world and you've actually had action. You've taken action. Here's our wizard over here. And so we did some early testing with older adults in the care facility we work with to understand sort of button layout and whether or not this sort of interactive portfolio of artwork would be an okay thing. Turns out it's a fine front-end interface, but sharing artwork at a distance, that's sort of a mess. What does that mean? This research we're doing was reviewed by 2 IRBs pretty strictly, and we said, yeah, sure, you know, we have these older adults, they're creating artwork. Yep, they do have cognitive impairment, they have an authorized representative, and we want them to put it online. And people started to panic, thinking, what does this mean? You're gonna, you know, there's layers of legal, ethical, and bureaucratic sort of things that we have to get through. So the important thing here, though, is that these individuals have a very limited sense of agency in whether and how they'd be able to share this work more broadly. So what we wanted to do was think about cultural and embodied forms of sharing, the metaphors that we have, as a way of scaffolding interaction with this system. So, for example, some early paper prototypes that we worked on with art therapists included using physical space as a way to delineate who you would share with. So you could bring little avatars in and out of a circle. You could use a scrapbook to provide contextual or biographical cues about this is a group of friends. So things like privacy setting, Facebook friend lists, Facebook groups, that doesn't really make sense here. So what are the right metaphors that would make sense? We even tried things like a microphone as a way of getting people to speak to a public audience. And this, turns out, this worked very well. A microphone, it was very clear. People, when they held the microphone, even a microphone that's not working, they sat up straight, they articulated, and they said, this is my message that I want to go beyond. The sharing circle also worked quite well. So taking these insights together, we created the moment system. So again, this is a higher fidelity version of the interactive frame you saw earlier. It has the Android tablet built into it and some Arduino buttons. So we have our clickable buttons on the screen as well, which were quite important for at least these older adults we've worked with for reaching in and being able to take control of the interface. But what's special here is that again, very simple computer vision going on here. We're using the front-facing camera on the tablet and the space in front of it. And the therapist can take little codes, paper codes, and add them to physical objects. And then when they're brought in front of the display, they can label the data. So think about this as an interactive health record, right? You have all of your information saved. And so this particular person said, I don't want anyone else to see this. This is very private to me. And so the therapist here is bringing in things like a lock, a treasure box, and a little trinket box. And all of these things say, keep to myself, just for me, right? And so for each individual, the therapist can customize which physical objects will be used and how they will label the data. So again, so you can kind of save these settings to the system. Now, all of this right now is offline. As I mentioned, there are multiple layers we're working through, and this is the kind of system that we're building for the purpose of understanding some of these challenges, right? Because we don't yet know what we don't know about what it means to share online with cognitive impairment. But people wanted to do things like this. So this is like a postcard where if you bring in an image of someone and you press scan on the system, that emails the message and the artwork to that person. Pretty straightforward. But then people wanted to do things like this. They wanted to have an online blog. They wanted to contribute to a broader community. Let all of their children randomly at any time they want come and see the content that they're creating. And so we've mocked this up using a Tumblr blog where now you can press a button on the system and it publishes artwork along with the audio comments to a blog. The family can record audio comments and then that's played back through the frame. But do we need, what would make this work? Closed, password protected, is that enough? Do we need the legal representative in the loop somehow, making a decision, right? Saying, no, I'm not quite sure I want you to share this. This has, I can see your oxygen tank, I can see your wheelchair. I don't want other people to see this. So other people are going to be weighing in on these decisions, as they already do for offline sharing. So we're looking at what sorts of mechanisms should be embedded in a system to do this. And this is sort of a straw man for us to discuss, right? There's a lot wrong here and a lot we're missing. So I'd love to come back to this in the discussion. Okay, so one very last study I'll touch on quickly goes deeper into the work of caregivers for people with cognitive impairments. So this is based on focus groups with 20 caregivers of individuals with cognitive impairments. So we wanted to understand what they're doing in terms of managing online life for their care recipients. And so we heard stories like this, this woman saying, my husband suffers from aphasia, mostly communication challenges, but your memory is affected when you're working on aphasia. And I'm very aware of, when he comes and goes. She says some days he'll stare blankly at the computer and she needs to step in and help him. Other days he's just fine off on his own. So she's really coming and going as needed. But then she said, recently he had his identity stolen. This is more and more of a problem. I know you've all seen it in the news. It's significant. Many people are subject to elder abuse and financial theft. Maybe you have your own personal experience with this and people in your family. Despite this event, she still helps her husband go online because it is so important to his quality of life and who he is as a person. Right, so to me, that's pretty significant. You could have a very poignant event like that and still want people to be active and engaged online. So in terms of caregivers, we know a lot about the physical, emotional, and social stress of caregiving. It's an intense burden. And so we've started designing technologies in HCI that can solve problems around like remote caregiving. Now you don't have to go over to a place to check on a loved one. You can sort of check remotely. But there's not a lot out there that says, what are caregivers doing to support the online lives of their care recipients? So that's what we're studying here. And what we found through our participants is that caregivers describe their support very much like the third hand as coming and going, trying to fade into the background when they were not needed. So one person said, it's like a roller coaster. It's up and down. It's a vicious cycle, and it's not just going down and staying down. He'll go down, then he'll come back up a little. So they don't want to restrict them in some way as people are sort of coming and going in terms of their abilities. So we identified 4 forms of work that caregivers were doing. Today I'll just present 2 of those. The first form of work caregivers are performing is connecting. So they're doing a lot to make their care recipient feel that they're connected in their online world. So one thing, and one reason for this is just like with Ethel and her photo album, they have a belief that visiting sites like Facebook and looking at people in your network is actually beneficial, that that's actually going to help in the long run people remember who is in their network and remember those social relationships. But they're also doing things like posting on behalf of their care recipient. You know, one person said, I'll post pictures. I'll say, Daddy went outside today, or Daddy was able to dress himself. So they're trying to post things that are positive and showing that this person is still active and engaged and making the rest of their network aware of their life experience. But at times this can really conflict. And so sometimes family members will post inappropriate things like Daddy was in diapers, right? And the caregivers and the family members sort of get in fights and go back and forth about what's the appropriate level of disclosure, especially when our goal is to make sure this person feels connected and involved in our little online world. Now, the second form of work that caregivers do is what we call protecting. So caregivers are regularly going through and filtering and removing distressing content from the news feeds of their care recipients. They do this through really, really inefficient strategies. They may share account credentials, right? And so they go in so that they have a single account that they're using and the caregiver goes through and makes sure there's nothing distressing. Like, for example, one individual encountered the same story of a train wreck 4 or 5 different times. And every time they would read the article, they would become distressed and anxious, and their caregiver would need to come to them and calm them down. They'd go away, forget they had that experience, come back, experience it again. So caregivers, just out of desperation, say, we can't do this. We can't even post about disasters. As a family, we have to get together and start reining in the content that our care recipients seeing. So they're developing these workarounds, like I said, sharing passwords or even setting up email filters. One thing that really surprised me too is that they're going through the person's network and they're deleting and defriending people who may be doing things that they consider inappropriate. Caregivers were really divided on this. Some said, yeah, it's my job to make sure there's no one in their network doing these things. Others said, no, it's not really my job. These were his friends before his accident or before the onset of dementia, so I'm just going to let him, interact with them. I'll do damage control and deal with it after the fact. So what's really clear here is that caregivers lack the sorts of mechanisms and tools to do the types of filtering and protecting work that they desire, and do that in a way that's still empowering of their care recipient. Okay, so coming back to this little diagram, what does this mean? Now that we know a little bit more about how caregivers might react in an online situation, does that mean they need to then approve everything, the information that's going both directions? That seems a little obsessive or a little too much to me, but you never know. Some caregivers might. And then what about the rest of the family network? How can we harness them? What about the sharing and retweeting and reposting that happens to, say, a person's online blog that's showing signs of dementia? So these are big questions, and there are really no clear answers here. I'd love to talk about it more. And I think, that's where I'll stop today. I think we have a few questions for us, but I hope, number one, I've convinced you of the complexities of designing for online experiences throughout older adulthood. That's the first thing. The second thing is sort of a call to action. I hope I've also convinced you that we are dreadfully underprepared for what's happening with future generations of online activity. As everyone in this room ages, cognitive impairment is not an automatic fate. There are lots of different theories around why it happens and why it doesn't. But it's still a situation where our, single user-centric mindset, single user accounts for a lot of the systems we have are breaking when we know that caregivers and care recipients become very intertwined towards the end of life. Okay, so with that, I would be glad to wrap up, and I want to thank my colleagues who have contributed to this research, and I look forward to discussing this more with Camille. Thank you.
So we're good.